Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our evening event. And I'm so happy to see so many of you here from so many different programs and professions. Some of you don't know this is a very long-awaited event. We had a little COVID interruption, and so we are thrilled to present Restraints and Seclusion in Maine Schools. We Can Do Better. And it is my honor to introduce Dr. Audrey Bartholomew, and you can see her description here. She's the Education Department Chair and Associate Professor, but what you don't know about her is that she is known as a rock star. So with that, Audrey, take it away.
Thank you, Shelley. I don't know that I've ever been introduced in a better way, and I'm definitely going to add that to my vita, just rock star. Excellent. I just want to thank everyone for coming this evening. I see a lot of familiar names and faces, but also a lot of unfamiliar names and faces. So I'm really excited about that. I'm going to use the word excited a lot. So I am so excited to be partnering with the Center for Excellence in Collaborative Education to bring this important topic to across the university and the community. As Shelley said, I approached CC many months ago about this, and I want to share a little bit about my journey and why this event is so important to me. I have worked with students with high support needs for over 20 years, and I can't think of one setting where I haven't experienced someone with a challenging behavior. As a grad student at Lehigh University, I worked for an adult service agency through the university that took clients who basically everyone turned away because they had challenging behaviors. Summers in college, I worked at a day camp for students with severe disabilities. And I distinctly remember waiting out a camper in the blazing humid sun heat who refused to move to the next activity. I have taught both high school and middle school students. I've had to clear the room due to students' aggressive behaviors. And I also remember one student, and if you're one of my UNE students, you might know this story, who would elope and leave my room and he would just roam the halls. And I would have to call the front office and say, student is on the move. I've had all these positions and all these experiences, and yet I have never been trained in restraints and seclusion. I have never considered it an option in my practice as a teacher supporting students. When I came to Maine, I was blown away by the number of reports by UNE students seeing these happening. Keep in mind, these students are basically general ed majors. None of them were spending much time in special education yet. The use of restraints and seclusion are so prevalent in the state. It just seems like it's a part of some schools' culture. A few years ago, I decided I had heard enough, and I sought out Ben, who is one of our speakers tonight, after an event, and I just said, hey, this is what I'm hearing. What's going on? What does this mean? And that really started the ball rolling a couple of years ago. I feel like Maine is currently, hopefully, experiencing a shift in the use of these practices, and I'm excited to see and be a very small part of it. As a university faculty member, sometimes I feel really disconnected, but I know that there are ways that I can use my position of privilege, and this is one of them to advocate for. So the goal of this event is to bring awareness, but also empowerment for those of you who may experience students with challenging behaviors presently and also in the future. So I'm going to take a moment and introduce our three speakers, which I am so excited and so thankful that they've taken some time out. You're going to hear first from Ben Jones. He is the managing attorney at Disability Rights Maine. He represents students with disabilities all across Maine. He's been with Disability Rights Maine since 2014. He has developed particular expertise in addressing the use of restraint and seclusion in schools and the delivery of early childhood special education services. He has worked in public interest law since 2011, and he received his JD from New England Law and his BA from the University of Vermont. Our second speaker is Dr. Clelia Seago. Dr. Seago is a board certified behavior analyst and certified school psychologist. Her background is in special education with a focus on individuals with developmental and intellectual disabilities who engage in severe problem behavior. She has a master's degree in special ed, a master's degree in educational psychology, and a doctorate in school psychology. She completed her postdoctoral fellowship at the Neurobehavioral Unit at the Kennedy Krieger Institute in Maryland and at the Southeastern Regional Education Service Center in New Hampshire. Dr. Segoe currently serves as faculty in the Educational Psychology Department at the University of Southern Maine, the Special Education Department at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and works as a school psychologist and behavior analyst in schools in Maine and New Hampshire. In her free time, which I'm not sure when that exists, she runs a behavior analyst dissemination website at learningbehavioranalyst.com. And I also want to just give a special shout out. Clelia is a LEND graduate, and that's how I met Clelia a couple years ago. Our third panelist this evening is Dr. Ross Green. He is the originator of the model of care called Collaborative and Proactive Solutions. Dr. Green was on the faculty at Harvard Medical School for over 20 years and is now founding director of the nonprofit Lives in the Balance, which provides a vast array of free web-based resources on the CPS model. Those of you, I'm just going to give a special shout out to my students who have Kristen Gorovin. You know all about Dr. Green. He has appeared in a wide range of media, including The Oprah Show, Good Morning America, The Morning Show, National Public Radio, Mother Jones Magazine, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, The Chicago Tribune, and The Boston Globe. Dr. Green lectures and consults widely throughout the world and lives in Portland, Maine. And finally, I just want to give a special shout out to our chat host, Molly Cadigan. Molly is a double major here at UNE in Health, Wellness, and Occupational Studies with Educational Studies. She will be checking the chat. And so feel free to share any questions, any concerns, anything you want to share. She will be following up with you in the chat. And I just want to say she's presently checking the mail every day to hear back from graduate programs in physical therapy she's applied to. So thank you so much. I am so excited for this event, and I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Ben Jones, our first speaker.
Thank you, Audrey. Thanks, everybody. For those that were on the pre-meeting, I've changed into my Maine tuxedo for all the fine folks in Bedford. Okay, I've got the slide deck up. Wonderful. So as Audrey said, I'm an attorney that practices in Maine and I represent kids. And, you know, we really came to this issue from seeing it in our cases, similar to Audrey seeing it in her practice as a teacher and educator. So it's very astounding what you're going to hear about the numbers and the prevalence. And I'm going to give kind of the legal side of things, the legal view, and really the guardrails. So the law puts the guardrails on what can and can't be done. And then Clelia and Ross are going to talk about what you should do instead. So let's go ahead to the next slide, please. Oh, this is just my contact info. So I'm guessing you guys will be provided with the slides, but in case you want to reach me, just call Disability Rights Maine and say, get me Ben. That's all you got to remember. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so quick overview. This is going to be very fast. You know, we have a tight schedule here, and I'm going to do about 18 minutes. So maybe three minutes or so on each of these. And just as a disclaimer, you know, this is not legal advice, and this would typically my piece would probably be 2 hours long. So we're going to do 2 hours and 18 minutes. And here we go. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about numbers. So Maine is unique in a very bad way. We are #1 in the use of restraint per capita in the country, and we're #2 for the use of seclusion in the country. And that works out to about 5 out of 1,000 students for restraint and 4 out of 1,000 students for seclusion. Okay, next slide. So that first slide was to do with the federal data, which is the state-by-state data that the public schools have to report. And now I'm shifting to the Maine data because we have our own data as well that we collect, our state. And what we see is these numbers going up year by year. So we've had a law on the books since 2012 where we've followed the data called Chapter 33. We'll talk a little more about that. But basically the numbers have gone up every single year. I didn't include 2020 and 2021 because COVID messed with the schedule, and a lot of kids weren't in school. So 2019 was our last year that we were all in person, all in school, and there were over 22,000 restraints or seclusions used on Maine students during that year. And like I said, we were brought to this issue from the cases that we see. And from those case records that I read through, there's these incident reports that result from a restraint or seclusion. And there's often restraints that aren't noted as a restraint. For example, a kid might be brought down a hallway to a seclusion room, and they don't call the bringing down the hallway to the seclusion room a restraint, even though clearly it was involuntary. The kid was being held. So the numbers are actually likely much even higher than 22,000. Next slide, please. Just a graphical of that progression. So it's probably not super clear to see, but 2014 is that first year, 2019 is that last one. That's the span I'm showing. And steadily increasing restraint and seclusion. Red is the restraints, and seclusions are the hash marks on the bottom. Next, please. Okay, so now we talk about students with disabilities. That was all students because the data applies to all students, but specific to students with disabilities, Maine has one of the highest percentage of students with disabilities, if not the highest, and it's around 19%, a little bit more than 19%. But these restraints and seclusions are used on those 20% of students the most. So over 90% of restraints and over 90% of seclusions throughout the state are used on these 20% of kids. So these are all our kids. I can say that for everybody in the room. These are our kids. Next slide, please. Just another data point to do with the restraint seclusion. This is also going to be a little hard to see. I took it from the US DOE, but you can look at the coloring will be the helpful part. So red is white students, orange is black students, blue is Hispanic or multiple races, and then green is, I believe, other races. There is a disproportionality based on race as well as by disability. And the most significant is for Black students. It's almost double, little less than double the prevalence. And it's actually higher for white kids too, strangely enough. So higher for white kids, much higher for Black kids, lower for Hispanic or Latino. Next slide, please. Okay, so like I said, Ross and Claudia are going to talk more about the substance. How do you actually address the underlying needs of these kiddos? And so I'm really just talking about the law and the consensus nationally and in Maine. And that consensus is that restraint and seclusion can have very serious consequences. The federal government has looked at this closely because there's been deaths, there's been major injuries for staff and for students when using these practices. And so they're concerned as well, obviously. And there's no evidence that using these are effective in addressing the underlying behavior. That's the consensus at the US DOE. Next slide, please. Also, the US Senate Committee, the HELP Committee, they did an investigation and they gathered records and spoke to experts and also found that there was absolutely no evidence that physically restraining a child or secluding them is therapeutic or educationally beneficial. Next slide, please. And the consensus in Maine is the same. So it's codified within our existing rules and laws. We put these statements in as well. And so I pulled those out, and the consensus in Maine is that restraint and seclusion is really only for emergencies. And it's not to be used for therapeutic or educational interventions. And it cannot be used for punitive purposes or staff convenience or to control challenging behavior. Next slide, please. So that's all the background about the data and the consensus and what we see in Maine specifically. And so what do we do in Maine to limit the use of these? The numbers are very high, and the use of it is potentially legal in some situations, but often not legal. So there's been extra protections put on for all students, and especially students with disabilities. And that new law has just come into effect within the last 3 weeks, actually. So let's talk about that. I'm going to call it 1373 because it doesn't have a catchier name yet. I should make one. Keeping All Students Safe Act is the national model that this is after. So my shorthand is Keeping All Maine Students Safe Act. So next slide, please. So this new law defines physical restraint as a personal restriction that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to move their arms, legs, or head freely. And it explicitly does not include physical escort, mechanical restraint, physical prompt, or chemical restraint. Those are defined elsewhere. It doesn't mean those are permitted, it just means they're defined elsewhere. And I put in the outdated definitions below on a few of these slides just to show you that there's been some improvements in terms of the protections. To do with the definition of physical restraint, it's not that much different. It's still, it's still an intervention. It's still restricting freedom. Next slide, please. Okay, so specifically unlawful. So the new law specifically lines out what's unlawful. And what's unlawful is the use of mechanical restraints, with the exception for things that are prescribed, like a seat belt, harness, etc. Chemical restraints, those that are not typically administered. Next slide. Unlawful restraint or seclusion also includes physical restraint or escort that's life-threatening, restricts breathing, restricts blood flow, including prone restraints. So folks might be aware of the term prone restraints. You see it in the news. It can result in death, we've seen nationally. And we just saw recently that it's used at Long Creek, the youth jail in Maine, in ways that are completely inappropriate and potentially very dangerous. So those are explicitly unlawful in schools. Next slide, please. More on the unlawful category. This one really is especially important for students with disabilities. So restraint and seclusion can now no longer be used on students with disabilities if it's contraindicated based on their disability. And contraindicated means not advisable, essentially. But for example, a student might have PTSD and has experienced seclusion in the past and was traumatized by it. That seems like a perfect example to have a psychiatrist or a health professional that the student works with write to the school and say, it would not be advised to have the student be secluded. It would be traumatizing for them. And then there's just examples of that type of documentation. It also could be, it doesn't have to be the healthcare professional. It could just be the team. So like an IEP team or a 504 team can get together and say, this is not working. Restraint is a bad thing for this kiddo. It's all bad for all kiddos, but specific to this kid because of their disability, it's especially bad and we really cannot do it. And so that would bar the school from using that measure. Okay, next slide, please. So what is the standard when you can use restraint and seclusion? Those are all the times you cannot use it. It can be used if there's an imminent danger of serious physical injury to the student or another person. And we haven't yet decided on a definition, the state of Maine, to do with what imminent danger means, but it's plain language, basically, if there's not a specific definition. So imminent meaning emergency, right away, happening now. Serious physical injury also will be defined in rulemaking, which is a process that's happening right now, but essentially a very serious thing. Also, it's not just that standard. Also, less restrictive interventions would be ineffective. So other things have been tried. other things have been considered, and it's still imminent danger, serious physical injury. And it can only last as long as that standard exists. So you can imagine a situation where a student is being moved down a hallway because, let's say, the standard was met, there was an imminent danger of serious physical injury. That student is being brought to seclusion and they're being restrained. It's hard to believe that there wouldn't be a moment where that emergency ends during that time, but certainly it has to be completely continuously monitored. So if that danger is gone because a new environment has been used, then that's the end. That it has to end at that point. And least amount of force necessary must be used. Next slide, please. I might start zipping through some slides too, just to stay tight here. But I put in the old standards in here as well. That if you don't get these slides, just email me. I'll send you the info. Okay, next slide. This is just a note about a change to escort and prompt. So like I said, these things have all been addressed under a previous law, and now there's a new law. And the addition for escort and prompt is that it must be voluntary, which was always true because restraint is by definition involuntary. And so it's just putting the clarity into the definition. So escorts and prompts must be voluntary. Next slide, please. Another great piece in this new law is the helping part. So those were all the when you can't do things, when it's unadvised, and when you can do things, when you can practice these things. But also within the law is affirmative help from the Department of Education. So they are explicitly told within this law, and they'll be putting together these, they're working on it right now, which is putting together some supports for schools. So a school could say, look, we've reviewed our numbers. They keep going up. We don't want to be doing this. We want to do better. Can you help us? The DOE will have resources and people to talk to. So I believe they already do have some resources, but this is going to be more. So that's great. Next slide, please. Okay, there's just a couple slides on this chapter 33. I keep mentioning what's going to happen to that. Some folks might know some of the specifics about this, but I'll keep it very general. So next slide. Basically, this old rule, chapter 33, still exists until there's a new rule. And anything that's in it is going to stay the same unless the new law changes a definition within it. So for example, I showed you that physical restraint has changed, the definition has changed. That would just be swapped out. And schools right now are writing up their own policies to make sure all these things mesh together, the new law and the existing chapter 33. But it is true that things will be much more clear for everyone in about probably February of next year when the rulemaking is complete, and there'll be more specifics. Okay, next slide. Oh, this is what I just said. I got ahead of myself. So a lot of things that were in chapter 33 that are great protections for students and progressive things. You're looking forward. Debriefing, the staff have to be trained, notices to families, a complaint procedure so that the families can complain if there's an issue. Next slide, please. Also, in the proposed amendments to chapter 33, there's a specific exception called deflection. And this was added, I think, because DOE was hearing from schools saying, well, what are we supposed to do? If a kiddo is coming at a staff, can we redirect them? Well, deflection fits that definition. Next slide, please. Okay, and just a last few on here. I have 1 minute. I'm going to just wrap up and talk about what the implications are for these students' rights when the restraint is included and happening to them. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm not going to go through this one, but basically IDEA is a big law that creates the IEPs, and that's one source of protections for kids. Another one is 504. That's an anti-discrimination law that applies to all kids with disabilities, including the ones with IEPs, but also including others. And then there's the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, and that's an anti-discrimination law as well. So those are all going to come into play. Next slide. I'm going to go over by 1 minute. I'm sorry, guys. Just put in some good resources here. So US DOE has explicitly said a student's right to get their free appropriate public education, which is the 504 and IDEA standard, can be infringed by the use of restraint and seclusion. So you can imagine how this would happen. If a kid's being pulled out of the classroom all the time, they're not being educated. If they're being restrained or secluded and it's harming them, you know, physically, mentally, that's going to take away from their ability to be educated. So these are just some good resources. Next slide, please. Another good resource. We're going to skip it. Next slide, please. Another good resource. Next slide, please. Okay, and then just a very relevant last slide. So the Office for Civil Rights, which enforces Section 504 and the ADA, they were investigating Saco School Department for the last 3 years. And they came out with an agreement just last week to explicitly say, using restraint and seclusion can infringe on students' free appropriate public education, just like we talked about. And Saco agreed to this complex agreement, which has a lot of good stuff in it. You know, it says you got to go back and review all of the students that have been restrained or secluded to see if they've had an impact or they need a compensatory education. You can't exclude kids after a restraint just because, you know, it has to be the regular process of suspension and expulsion. And they can't use law enforcement as frequently as they were. And all staff have to be trained. So ending on that relevant note, and now I'm going to kick it over to Ross Green. Thank you.
Ben, thanks. You all should know that Ben has been a driving force behind dramatically reducing or eliminating restraint or seclusion in Maine. If we can get me to my first slide, that would be ideal. We are currently on my last. So Ben did a great job of covering what's going on legally. And Maine, though it may be at the fore of restraint and seclusion in terms of numbers and percentages, Maine is also one of the states that has passed legislation to dramatically reduce and restrict the use of restraint and eliminate the use of seclusion. In the chat, which I have been looking at closely as Ben was speaking, people are wondering, why is this so? And it's the same reason that it is so in any place that it is so. And I think it's complicated. I think it's hard to work with kids who have concerning behaviors. I think that kids with concerning behaviors are frequently not very well understood. But I'm going to focus a little bit on mindset and training as important factors that are contributing to the tremendous overuse of restraint and seclusion. Whenever I'm seeing schools, and there are some in Maine that use restraint and seclusion far more heavily than others, and sometimes it is those schools that are most vehement in their defense of restraint and seclusion procedures and tell us why restraint and seclusion are so necessary for some kids who have significant concerning behaviors. I find that the conversation becomes a whole lot more productive when we stop trying to justify our use of restraint and seclusion and start talking about how unnecessary they are in many of the instances in which they're used, and start working on how we dramatically reduce our reliance on restraint and seclusion. But among the mindset issues there is a very popular belief that restraint and seclusion keep kids and caregivers safer. And I am aware of no data, none, telling us that that is the case. There is a very popular mentality that restraint and seclusion are crisis prevention interventions. They are not. They are crisis management interventions. So is de-escalation. So is giving a kid a break as they are becoming escalated. If you are at the point that the kid is becoming escalated, and I have a slide that shows this quite nicely, you're late. And if you're late, you are now in crisis management mode. Fortunately, the factors that are causing concerning behaviors that are leading to de-escalation and that are leading to restraint and seclusion are highly predictable and can be addressed proactively so that we don't find ourselves restraining and secluding kids anymore. Now, there's one other mindset issue. Some of the schools that justify their use of restraint and seclusion, including here of Maine, talk about how difficult their students are. However, there are many, many, many schools in the United States that are working with kids of an exact same level of difficulty that are not using restraint and seclusion. So I don't find that that one carries a whole lot of weight either. Here's what I have found. If a school commits to dramatically reducing their use of restraint and seclusion, my experience is that they'll cut their use of restraint and seclusion by 50% just by deciding that they want to, just by committing to that. The other 50% is a little bit harder. So in the schools, but also inpatient units and residential facilities and prisons, in which I and my colleagues at Lives in the Balance, which is my Maine-based nonprofit, not mine, it's a Maine-based nonprofit that I founded. How do we help schools and treatment facilities dramatically reduce or eliminate their use of restraint and seclusion? And folks, this is going to be fast. Next slide, please. One crucial ingredient is that we help them stop focusing on kids' concerning behaviors and trying to modify those behaviors. And we help them focus instead on the problems that are causing those behaviors and solving them. Words cannot describe what a radical shift that is in focal point. See, in the collaborative and proactive solutions model, we view concerning behaviors simply as the means by which a kid is communicating. We've all heard behavior is communication. What is behavior communicating? Concerning behavior is communicating that there is an expectation a kid is having difficulty meeting, period. And in the CPS model, we are focused on the expectations the kid is having difficulty meeting. In the CPS model, we call those unsolved problems, also known, by the way, as problems that have yet to be solved. Also known, by the way, as problems that are waiting to be solved. It is only unsolved problems that set in motion concerning behaviors. Solved problems don't. Next slide, please. So in this model, we help caregivers learn how to be problem solvers. Now, educators have always been in the problem solving business, but especially when it comes to academics. Why we have such a different mentality when it comes to the concerning behaviors that are often caused when students are struggling with academics is beyond me. For me, academics and concerning behavior go hand in glove. They are inseparable. If you're a problem solver on kids' academic difficulties, you are also a problem solver on the concerning behaviors that are being caused in some of them when they are struggling with those academics. Now, I should let you know that a very popular phrase that often comes up when I or my colleagues are helping schools or facilities dramatically reduce or eliminate the use of restraint and seclusion is, I hate seeing kids get restrained or secluded over expectations we already know the kid cannot reliably meet. If you ask me, the majority of restraints and seclusions are occurring over expectations we already know the kid cannot reliably meet. And if we know that already, then we can be proactive in either solving those problems, or in temporarily at least eliminating those expectations for now. Next slide, please. So in this model, the problem solving is collaborative, not unilateral. But the problem solving is also proactive. But you can only be proactive in solving problems if you identify two crucial pieces of information about a student in advance. First of all, we have to figure out what the kid's lagging skills are. And I refer to lagging skills and unsolved problems as the information that's been missing. Lagging skills answer the question, why is this kid responding so poorly to problems and frustrations? And what the research that's accumulated over the last 40 to 50 years tells us is that kids who are responding poorly to problems and frustrations are lacking skills, not motivation. Therefore, motivational strategies are going to be of little utility in reducing restraint and seclusion, because those are focused on behavior. They are not focused on the lagging skills that are causing those behaviors. When do kids exhibit concerning behavior? As we've already covered, when there are expectations they are having difficulty meeting. By the way, just like the rest of us. Except in the case of the kids who are being restrained and secluded, there's no doubt about it. Their concerning behaviors are bigger and scarier and sometimes more dangerous. But those behaviors are not unpredictable. They are being caused by highly predictable, unsolved problems, which can be identified proactively and either solved or temporarily removed proactively. Next slide, please. This is the graphic. And I am not even going to come close to getting through most of my slides, but I cannot skip this one. This graphic represents the sequence of restraint and seclusion. The colors of the 5 bubbles are actually meaningful. In blue, everything that's early. In red, everything that's late. You don't want to be late, you want to be early. Late is crisis management. Early is crisis prevention. What's early? Figuring out what expectations a kid is having difficulty meeting, what are the kid's unsolved problems, and solving those problems proactively so that we never find ourselves in the red. And so a very big part of the CPS model is helping people learn how to use an assessment tool called the assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems to identify lagging skills and unsolved problems proactively so that we can get out of the heat of the moment. Now, if that's what was going on in most places where kids with concerning behaviors hang out, there would be almost no restraints and seclusions left. The problem is that that is not what is mostly being done. What is mostly being done when a kid has difficulty meeting a particular expectation? Red bubble number 1, pushing the kid harder, insisting harder. Founded, I think, on the belief that insisting harder elicits better performance, which has not been my experience. My experience is that pushing kids harder to meet expectations we already know the kid cannot reliably meet elicits red bubble number 2, concerning behavior. I want you to notice something very important about behavior. It's late. The behavior is late. And interventions that are focused on behavior are interventions that are focused on what's late. If the behavior tells us that the kid, oh, by the way, what is the behavior communicating? What we already knew. The kid is having difficulty reliably meeting a particular expectation. If the kid's behavior suggests to us that the kid is becoming escalated, red bubble number 3 is to de-escalate the kid, which is what our crisis prevention, but really crisis management training taught us to do. if our de-escalation efforts do not accomplish the mission, what do we do next? We restrain or seclude the kid, once again, founded on the belief that restraint and seclusion keep us and the kids safer. Once again, no data to support that belief. So in the CPS model, what are we helping people do? And I'm going to go just maybe a minute over here. We're teaching people how to identify lagging skills and unsolved problems. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. I'm not going to have time for that one. We are teaching people how to use the instrument called the assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems that helps us figure out what a kid's lagging skills and unsolved problems are. It makes intervention proactive. It helps us view kids through much more compassionate, accurate, productive lenses. And it helps us focus on problems, not on the behaviors that are being caused by those problems. And the second thing we help people learn how to do is solve those problems collaboratively and proactively. Now, I included slides in my handouts that give you a little bit of information on how to do that, but I am out of time. So let me just scroll through very quickly what I've got left and see if there's anything else I want to comment now. That's the assessment of lagging skills and unsolved problems. You can find it on the Lives in the Balance website. Next. Next. Skipping that one. Next. Next. There are 3 steps that are involved in solving a problem collaboratively. This is what I spend most of my waking moments teaching caregivers how to do. 3 steps. The empathy step is where you are gathering information from the kid. Yes, even if the kid is non-speaking. Yes, even if the kid is so-called low functioning. We need to find out, we need to gather information from the kid about what's making it hard for the kid to meet a particular expectation. Step number 2 is where adults are entering their concerns into consideration. And step number 3 is where kid and caregiver are putting their heads together and collaborating on a solution that addresses the concerns of both parties. On that note, I will now introduce Dr. Clelia Sego, who is going to be talking about a different approach to ending restraint and seclusion. And even though Dr. Sego and I don't agree on everything, one thing I'm sure that we do agree on, we've got to get rid of restraint and seclusion, no matter what that looks like. And as I've always said, I don't care if people use collaborative and proactive solutions to get rid of restraint and seclusion. I just care that they get rid of restraint and seclusion. Dr. Sego, you're on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Green. Well, I knew this was going to be kind of a tough act to follow. So indeed that occurred. So hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many people from Lent and people I know. All right, I'm going to hang on to my own slides here. So let's see if I can make that happen. And I'm actually going to start a timer because I'm working on self-management. Okay, here we go. So I'm Clelia. I'm a BCBA and a school psych. And I'm mostly here to talk about my perspective as somebody who's really chosen to have a career working with individuals who engage in so-called severe problem behavior. That's really what I love to do. I've been doing it for about a decade and I'm going to do it until I can't. So from reading the chat, clearly the assumption that I made is a good one, which is that we're here because we don't really need the rationale for reducing restraint and seclusion explained to us. So I'm not going to hover here very long. Like Ben said, same for me, very obviously what I'm giving is not legal advice. I'm not even an attorney, but also none of this is clinical advice, right? So if you're thinking, oh, I have this student and I should do whatever Clelia said, please don't. I don't know your student. You need to connect with a professional who knows your student. Okay, so my perspective on restraint and seclusion and what we can do instead. And I'm actually going to move people down here. So first of all, what are we talking about when we talk about interfering behavior, problem behavior, challenging behavior? I tend to use the term interfering behavior. I think it's, to me, it's one of the less stigmatizing ones, and it puts the emphasis not really on, certainly not on the individual as a problem, but more on the fact that their behavior gets in the way of them having an awesome life, which is kind of the point of why we want to address it. So these are sort of the big five in research when we talk about severe challenging behavior. We have physical aggression, so aggression towards others. We have self-injury, which is, of course, hurting yourself. We've got disruption, which is sort of the catch-all around other behaviors that, depending on what we're looking at, could be disruptive but not unsafe, or disruptive and unsafe. For example, depending on what it is, property destruction could be safe or unsafe. Elopement, which is heading on out in an unsafe way. And we have pica, which is ingesting things that are not food. Elopement and pica in the literature actually have the highest rates of resulting in fatalities for folks with disabilities, because they can end up losing their lives from drowning, or from being in traffic, or from ingesting things like batteries or things that are poisonous. Okay. So let's talk about PBIS for a second. Positive behavioral interventions and supports. That is a mouthful, and it's also a framework for organizing. Okay, we all want to have awesome schools that treats people fairly, treats people equitably, that's welcoming for everyone, that makes sure that we're not making assumptions about what people need or what people know when they come through the door or don't know, and whether that's staff or students. So how do we do that? How do we organize our thinking and our systems around that? And that's essentially what PBIS does. So people do their whole careers in PBIS, right? It's a whole branch of work. And here I am putting it into like 5 seconds. So of course you should get more resources if you want to understand it more. And I do have some resources linked at the end of the slide. But basically what we're looking at with PBIS is that we're going to create practices that meet kids and staff where they are. So we're not going to assume that people have, like I said, everything that they need to be successful in our setting. We're actually going to provide that. And that means students, but it also means staff. We're not, if we're in a PBIS school, we're not going to assume that staff have the skills, the exact skills that we've been talking about, right? Proactivity skills, skills around interacting with individuals who may be experiencing some of those challenges. So PBIS is all about proactivity. It's all about creating a system where people have their needs met before they have to engage in crisis. I appreciated what Ross said about framing restraint seclusion not as a crisis prevention. I mean, if I put my hands on somebody and they don't want me to, does that sound like crisis prevention? That's obviously a crisis. The fact that I did that is in itself a crisis. Okay, so why are we talking about PBIS in tier 1 during a presentation about physical management? I think really for the same reason that we would make sure that we have healthy food in our fridge and we don't have a bunch of junk food all over our house, because it's one thing to know, right, and be told what the right thing is. And we're great at telling kids what we think they should do. No problem with that. But we're also great at telling people how to live healthy lives. And that's still challenging, right? It's not a knowledge issue all the time. There's a skill deficit. There's an lack of environmental support, other things going on. So the same way we stock our fridge with healthy food, that's also the reason we would want to create a school that proactively supports skill building and healthy behavior. We're going to go through this really quick. I will give these slides to Audrey later, or she already has them, so you can have them from her if you'd like. But these are sort of the foundational pieces that you would want to have at the classroom level of PBIS for everyone. This is not for kids who are already, quote unquote, problematic, right? This is for everyone, because we don't assume that people are going to behave in a way that aligns with our expectations unless we create an environment that supports that and that explicitly teaches how to problem solve, how to get needs met. So in terms of thinking about, where we're so far away, like teaching things like raising your hand or like walking in a line, how is that? That's so far away from restraint and seclusion. But I think if we think about, we have this flood of kids being restrained and secluded. And of course, we want to provide them effective intervention so that happens less for those kids. But I think it's also extremely valuable to go upstream and think, okay, at the systems level, what are we missing here? How did all of this happen? Can we head back upstream and figure out at the systems level, what could we be doing better? What can we learn about this? And rather than just doing, putting out fires essentially. And this isn't just for teachers. If you're in a school, you're part of that school culture, regardless of who you are, what you do there. So this is not just about classroom teachers having special practices. This is about a culture of teaching skill and creating an environment that supports healthy behavior. And as we know, because we're all here, some students need far more intensive support than that. Maybe we don't know why. Maybe they're in highly supportive environments. We think they're highly supportive and it's just not meeting their needs. We don't know why. Their behavior is telling us that it's not meeting their needs. Maybe they don't have strong universal supports. Maybe they're not in a PBIS school. Maybe their classroom experience is unfortunately not supportive of healthy behavior. Maybe they have a disability that might get in the way of accessing what we're trying to teach them. Maybe they have a traumatic history. They have something going on in their past that makes their present really hard. Maybe it's a combination of those things. Could be something else. For whatever reason, even when we have strong universal supports, that doesn't meet everyone's needs. So FBAs and individualized interventions can come in at this point. An FBA is a functional behavioral assessment, and it's really helpful, in my opinion, to think about FBAs not so much as what the process is, because the process can vary wildly. I prefer to think about FBA as a way to answer specific questions. And the questions are essentially, okay, we have this challenge behavior. Why is it happening? In other words, what's the unmet need? It's not happening for no reason. The person has a need that's not being met except through challenging behavior. So there's something to learn for us there. And what can we do to teach a better, safer, happier way? To me, if we're answering the first question, not the second, then I don't really care about the first, right? Of course, we want to actually move forward and do something good. So in terms of procedures, I'm just going to really gloss over this because there's no way that we can do this justice. It would have to be like a much longer situation, which is fine. But we might be looking at interviews or other ways of gathering data, observations. There might be something called a functional analysis, which I personally do a lot, which is where we actually get right into the environment and see when we have unanswered questions about what's going on, when maybe the person can't tell us why or whether they are speaking or not. Maybe they're confused about why they do what they do. And that happens to all of us, right? We don't always have super clear answers about what the unmet needs are that we have when we engage in behaviors. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. So we can get into the environment and actually change some things environmentally to answer questions about what the unmet need is. So I think that's really cool. And I like doing that. To me, there's no right way to do an FBA. It's more about, are we getting the answers to questions? So to me, the FBA was done right. If it was safe, if it was respectful, certainly respectful to the child, but also to the family and to the team. Did it give us applicable, testable information? Are we keeping ourselves accountable to helping that student move forward with their life? Does it lead to high quality outcomes? If it does, great. You did a great job with the FBA. And I'd like to highlight here, of course, that cases can be more clinically straightforward or less clinically straightforward. And oftentimes it's not about the level of safety risk that the behavior poses. That can be part of the complexity, but part of the complexity is also about what's the unmet need there, right? And what's the history with it, and what's the level of support that the person is going to need to learn a safer, happier way to get that unmet need met. In terms of intervention, again, one slide, I mean, insufficient, but here we go. So good intervention would be informed by the outcome of an FBA. Oftentimes, once we know the unmet need or unmet needs, because there can of course be more than one, we can think about teaching a communication response. Even if the person is very skilled at speaking, that doesn't mean that they have the skill of advocating for themselves in the setting in which the challenging behavior occurs. And that's a really important point, that the person could still be having a huge amount of difficulty communicating, even if they don't have a motoric problem associated with forming words. Those are not the same thing. Oftentimes folks really struggle to wait. They struggle to tolerate unavailability. They struggle to be flexible. Many folks with certain learning profiles may really be challenged with discriminating what different things in their environment means. Like for example, they might have different styles of understanding when other people communicate with them. So we need to think about ways that we can make that clearer for them. And ultimately, of course, we're here to teach skills that lead to cool stuff, right? We want kids to have really good lives. So what kinds of skills does the person need to make that happen? So again, to me, the right plan, the right intervention is right if it's safe, if it's respectful to everyone involved. Does it demonstrate clear effectiveness? I don't care if it looks good, if your report looks awesome. Is it working for the person? Can you demonstrate that it's helping? Are you making the person's world bigger instead of smaller? For example, if we're able to bring the unsafe behavior down to zero by drastically reducing all expectations and all possible triggers and then just staying there forever, okay, well, that person's world got much, much, much smaller, right? You didn't teach any new skills. You just took all the bad stuff away. You didn't give them anything back. Not cool. So skill building to me has to be part of an intervention plan. It's not just about making the behavior go away. And again, of course, teams need training and support with this, just like any other kind of professional endeavor, right? There's a lot to this, and that can be hard. Okay, so just as to give you like a really quick overview of what I might do when I start a consult for a case that involves severe challenging behavior. Right away, I would want to make the environment safer. Exactly like Ross said, I'm not a big fan of just pushing through and pushing through and pushing through. There's no plan to teach a skill. There's no real reason to do it other than this is what we're supposed to do in schools. I disagree. I don't think that pushing through for the purpose of, highlighting that we're in charge is helpful or appropriate. We're in charge to the extent that we can make the right decision. That's what I think. So, and if we modeled that, that would help. So to me, of course, this gets very tricky legally because we have issues around making sure that the students have access to everything on their IEP. So it has to be a team decision because we shouldn't come in and change the person's placement unilaterally. But thinking about, okay, as of right at this moment in time, what could we do to make the environment safer if we could have anything we wanted, and then work backwards from there, right? Make sure that we're, communicating with families, often openly, making sure we're not just communicating about the undesired stuff that's happening. Keep in mind that they're not responsible for the fact that you're having difficulty with their child's problem behavior. That's not somehow on them to fix. It's a problem for everyone to work on. Also, keep in mind, I've become increasingly aware of this over time, that it's unfortunately very possible that the families that we're communicating with have unresolved trauma, possibly from altercations in schools when they were in school. So just treading lightly around that, and bringing people in as collaborators, making sure that we're all working on the same problem. And then as soon as possible, once we have a safer option, we need to connect with resources. We need to talk about how we're going to assess this unmet need. How are we going to select and teach skills that are missing to meet the unmet need? And how are we going to organize ourselves so that we know that what we're doing is helping? How are we going to know if it's not helping and we need to change it? How are we going to move forward with this plan and not just stay in a place where we've taken all the bad stuff away? We need to give good stuff back. Okay, I have 2.5 minutes to go. So here's some, just a case study. This is Emily. When I started, of course, not her real name. When I started working with Emily, she was being restrained and secluded on a daily basis. She was in kindergarten and in gen ed and just really having a rough time. And she's just an example of somebody who was able to go to 0% physical management really quickly when we figured out what her unmet needs were. We met them more fully. We taught her skills to get those unmet needs met. And we also taught her staff skills around when she is unsafe, what can we do that doesn't involve, putting our hands on her. Chase is another friend that I worked with. Chase represents probably the second most severe case of self-injury that I've ever seen. He was really struggling very, very significantly. He was spending hours of his day in mechanical restraint. And that's really rough. And his unmet need was attention/connection. He really wanted people to comfort him, to hold him, and he had absolutely no means of communicating. And so he went to school every day, and nobody on his team had any idea what to do, right? They were doing the best they could, which was providing him with that attention connection when he engaged in self-injury. And so when he came to us in a highly clinical setting, his baseline rate of self-injury was close to 1 per second. And that's a lot of self-injury. And 3 weeks out of intensive treatment, he had a reliable means of communication, and he could wait for 6 minutes when told that attention wasn't going to be available. He could wait safely for 6 minutes. So between 1 per second and being able to wait for 6 minutes is absolutely amazing, and so proud of him. Considerations about creating safety. I can't go through all of these, but essentially we're thinking about when the behavior does occur, are we ready to do our part to make it as least high risk as possible? Restraint seclusion is for a last resort measure to ensure that nobody is seriously harmed. And we have something to say proactively about whether that behavior that the child might engage in does indeed lead to serious harm. As Ross said, these are rarely unpredictable. It's very, very common to be able to describe ahead of time what the behavior will look like. So what are we doing with our physical environment? What are we doing with our behavior? I'm not even talking about a treatment plan. I'm talking about the physical and environmental changes that we can make to drastically reduce the number of times that we have to put our hands on kids. And I know that these can work because I've used them so often.
Claudia, I know you have some final thoughts, and I'm wondering if you can move those to, because I want to give the participants a time for breakout.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm at 21, so I'm gonna wrap it up.
Okay, perfect.
Yep. Sorry. Yes. I mean, I could go either way, but yeah, I'll
Okay.
be done right now and we can talk more after. So I'll stop sharing.
Okay. Thank you to our speakers, Ben, Claudia, and Ross, and especially to those of you who are keeping that chat fast and furious. Good luck, Molly, pulling out some of those themes. So what we're going to do now is I have a very basic case of a student, and I'm going to pull that up on the screen and I'm going to read that to you. And then everybody's going to be put into breakout rooms with some guiding questions. So let me pull that up. And then let me share. So this is Lewis. Originally Lewis was Sam and I changed the name. So you're going to see Sam and Lewis, but it's the same student, I swear. He's a 3rd grade student. He receives special ed services in a self-contained behavior support program for most of his day. He likes to ride his bike with friends, and he says his favorite part of the day is recess, which is pretty typical of a 3rd grade student. He's in a self-contained full-time program due to his need for structure and individualized instruction. Lewis often struggles when he needs to transition from preferred to non-preferred activities. So when he's really liking what he's doing and it's time to move to something that he doesn't like, he struggles, especially when technology is involved. He really likes technology. Often Lewis's go-to response is refusal, and this behavior will often escalate to throwing items in the class and physical aggression. So as a result, Lewis is both restrained and secluded often. This is upsetting his parents, and they want to know what is going on and why this keeps happening. So what your task is when you move to your breakout room is to discuss these 3 questions. What questions do you have about Lewis? So we have very little information about Lewis. So what are some things that we might want to find out about Lewis? What contribution could you make to his team? So many of you have identified professional roles. If you as a classroom teacher, special ed teacher, occupational therapist, physical therapist, nurse, what contribution do you think you could make? And then if you don't, really have a specific role, or you just have some suggestions in general for the IEP team. So this is a lot of what Ross and Clelia spoke about. Please identify a scribe in your group and identify some key takeaways from your discussion. And then the easiest way to report that out is to copy and paste that into the chat box. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and move you into breakout rooms. Go ahead and put that into the chat box. We'll give everybody a moment just to do that. We're going to debrief, and then also, Molly, if you have anything from the chat, this is a good time for a quick Q&A. Lots of.
A lot of folks seem to want to know what is his disability or perhaps diagnosis, to being very curious about something they don't quite know yet what's going on with Lewis.
So I purposely left out his disability only because, when we think about providing supports, we want to individualize those to the student, though we really don't know much about Lewis. So I try not to use labels if I can avoid them. So, but it's probably safe to say that Lewis probably has an emotional behavioral disorder. So that's a good question. Let's see, what else? What else are we seeing in the chat box?
Something that my group talked about was what is he currently getting to help him with transitions? and like how have those been working out for him?
Same with my group. We talked about what has worked in the past and does he have a current positive behavior support plan? Good. Let's see. Our group also talked about if there was any sensory needs that the student had, if there was anything that that might help him. I see group 6 talked about using some strategies around being proactive, which I think that's what we heard a lot from the speakers, and possibly using seeing what the teacher is doing already with those transitions. Like, is she using a timer? Is she using some warnings? Kristen, your group talked about identifying lagging skills with transitions. So looking at what are those preferred activities and incorporating those into transitions, incorporating the parent's view. People talked a lot about they needed more information.
Yeah, I like Emily Thomas's group, breakout group 7, the OT's comments. You know, what are the environmental supports, what emotional regulation and coping strategies? And I'm curious in that group what the education students, how the OTs and the education students kind of dialogued about that, because there's beautiful symmetry in, you know, how you can work together. Emily, I see you there. Are you willing to open up your unmute? Can someone unmute Emily Thomas?
Yes.
There you go.
Are you just
Hello. So the other 2 members of my group are undergrad occupational therapy students. So we're all from OT. But we talked a little bit about maybe like the aspects of being outside and recess that he enjoys and how we could bring those inside, if it's the social or the physical or anything along those lines.
Thank you so much.
Some questions that were brought up throughout the presentation. One in particular was like, why are the rates of restraints and seclusions in Maine specifically high? And would this have to do with underreporting from other states?
And I don't know if Ben, that came up during your part of the presentation, if you know, why is Maine so high? And I think I was actually the one to ask that because I don't know the answer.
It's a good question. We should find out why. I think it's from folks' examples, we can see why. I mean, it's happening. It's an old way of thinking. It's a dangerous way of thinking. And we have it here. It's possible that it's underreporting elsewhere, but we don't know that. We can just guess, and from the numbers that we do have, they're bad. So,
Great. Molly, was there like one more pressing question? Because then I'm going to give it to our speakers to kind of give their final thoughts.
A lot of what came up too had to do with what should the parents do after the fact, and how they should react to it.
And I think under the current chapter 33 requirements, parents are notified. Ben, do they have to have a meeting? And a
Yep,
restraining
parent-
decision happens?
sorry.
Don't go ahead.
The parent has to be notified within 24 hours that it occurs, and then have it in writing within a week. And then there's a debriefing requirement, but just for the student and the staff, not with the family. So after 3 incidents happen, there's an IEP meeting or a different meeting if there's not an IEP in place. So there's those follow-ups built in.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and give it to our final thoughts. So I'm going to let Clelia, if you would like to go first and just sort of share any final thoughts that you have, and then we'll go to Ross, and then we'll go to Ben. We'll kind of go in like, opposite direction that we went in the beginning.
Sure, awesome, thanks. I think that overall I'm left with just a feeling of being really encouraged by how many people are here talking about this. I think that's pretty important. And I also think that like all of our roles are really important in making this change. Special ed teachers have obviously a special place in my heart because that's what I used to do, and it's the best job ever. I wonder all the time how long it will be until I just can't not be a special ed teacher again. And there really is, just know that if you're, yeah, Audrey, I know we have that in common. If you're in a leadership role in a classroom, you have a tremendous amount of power. You can really change lives in all kinds of ways, including the way that you orient to restrain seclusion, how skilled you are in what you're going to do instead, proactively and reactively. So that's one of the points that I'm really left with. The other point is I do want to make sure that we're not leaving out of the conversation the students who are on the tippy top of that triangle, for whom we may not be able to create safety in non-physical ways on day one. Those are my people. I mean, they're amazing to work with, and they're absolutely capable of learning new skills and not needing to be restrained or secluded ever. Can that happen on day one, especially in schools that are underfunded, that are undertrained, that are understaffed? I'm skeptical that that can happen. I worry about what we're incentivizing when we say that restraint seclusion should never ever happen. One of the things that we're possibly incentivizing is calling law enforcement. And if you've ever watched somebody in law enforcement handling that situation, you know that's probably not ideal, or definitely not ideal. We also talk about students having shortened days to quote unquote manage challenging behavior. Well, no, they need to be in school, right? So I do think for a tiny minority of kids, we need to be having those really challenging conversations about how everyone needs support to learn these new skills. And I'll stop there because I mean, I could talk about this for a really long time, but thanks for listening. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Claudia, for those honest remarks, for sure. Ross, do you have a final thought?
Ross, you're muted.
I could speak for Ross if he's not ready.
Ben, thank you so much. And truth is, I think you could. I'll be quick. You know, I think everybody who is probably on this program appreciates that if there's a better way to do something, a restraint and seclusion shouldn't be used. If there's a way to improve safety without restraining and secluding kids, that's what we should be doing. But if anybody needs any more convincing, I would encourage you to hop on the website of Lives in the Balance and go to the advocacy section and watch the 90-minute feature-length documentary film called The Kids We Lose, which we produced and released in 2018, but with fair warning that it is a brutal but very honest look at what we're still doing to kids. It's there, it's streaming on the website, so there's nothing to buy, and there's quite frankly nothing to buy on the entire website. If you want any more information on the collaborative and proactive solutions model, all kinds of free stuff on the Lives in the Balance website to take you way beyond what I could tell you about in 15 minutes. And here's the cool thing. The legislation passed. We now have to grapple with this. And it's a good thing that we're now grappling with it. I think we should have been grappling with it even if the legislation didn't pass, but the legislation did pass. Let's get this show on the road. Ben, I'm sure that is exactly what you would have said.
I would have led with collaborative and proactive solutions, but that's okay. Yeah. No, I just very quickly, it was wonderful. The breakout group was my favorite part. It was wonderful to talk with young people that are up and coming, and everyone's instincts are right. Trust your initial instincts. Supporting kids can be safe and effective, and you do not need to use these practices. And it's possibly that it's illegal. So if the legal piece comes up, call me. I also, part of my job is to provide technical assistance to non-parents. So if you're an OT, PT, speech language, any practicing professional, you can give me a call and just ask general questions. You know, just keep it general. And if you see a kid that you're worried about or a family that you're worried about, give them my info. Thank you.
So I want to close this event. I really don't want to close this event because it's been unbelievable. I want to thank Ross and Clelia and Ben and Audrey. And I really want to thank the participants. You were amazing. The questions and the comments and the passion that was in the chat was phenomenal. So thank you so much. And I know, Chris, we have to get to the attendance slide and others, so I'll pass it to you. And thank you, everybody.
Are you seeing the attendance slide on the screen? Anyone?
Yes, we are.
Excellent. Take a moment to complete the attendance and take a moment to note our next events, which may not be equally as fun, but they will be very engaging, and we'd love to see you there.